Every empire begins with a dream. Every legend leaves a legacy. Every story is connected. A man with secrets. A story worth millions. Welcome to the Sea-Town Slim universe. Finesse and Polish Episode 2, Castle Grey Skull. All right, you sorry motherfuckers. Chow time. The correction officer's voice exploded through the cell block, ripping Frederick Patterson from a deep sleep. The officer stood in the doorway wearing the same smug grin FP had grown accustomed to over the past year. For one brief moment, Frederick imagined grabbing him by the uniform and settling things the old-fashioned way. He knew better. One mistake inside these walls could cost him everything. Instead, he answered with a cold stare that said more than words ever could. The officer chuckled to himself before moving on to disturb the next inmate's morning. Frederick climbed down from his bunk. He brushed his teeth, splashed cold water across his face, then stood silently before the scratched-up piece of plastic the prison called a mirror. 1 year, exactly 1 year had passed since the shootout, the chase, and the crash that changed his life forever. The state of Ohio had wanted him dead. The prosecutors pushed for the death penalty from the very beginning. Only one man could have changed everything, the gas station attendant. But when it came time to testify, his memory suddenly disappeared. No eyewitness, multiple bodies, 4 different weapons recovered from the scene. In the end, the death sentence disappeared. Life without parole took its place. Frederick stared into the scarred reflection. The man looking back wasn't the same man who once drove a black Eldorado through the streets of Cleveland. That man had lived by his own rules. This man belonged to Mansfield Correctional Institution, known by every inmate inside its walls as Castle Grey Skull. FP, you should see the female guards they just hired. Brian Anderson's voice echoed into the cell before he did. Frederick turned around and couldn't help but smile. Brian always found a way to inject life into a place that had very little of it. He was 5'4", barely 135 pounds soaking wet, the smallest inmate in Mansfield. When Brian first arrived from the county jail, his size made him an easy target for predators looking to prey on weakness. That changed the day he and Frederick Patterson became friends. Word spread quickly throughout the institution. Brian belonged to FP's circle. From that day forward, the problem stopped. Brian wasn't a violent man by nature. His life sentence came from one terrible decision made while drugs clouded his judgment. Most people inside judged him by the crime. Frederick looked beyond it. He saw a man who had lost his way, not a monster. If addiction had never entered Brian's life, Frederick believed he could have become almost anything. What? Frederick laughed while pulling on his state-issued shirt. The warden bring in some fresh faces to drive you crazy? Brian threw both hands into the air. I'm serious, FP. You gotta see him. Frederick shook his head, pulling on his prison pants before slipping into his worn Chuck Taylor tennis shoes. You've been locked up too long. Brian grinned. So have you. Frederick laughed. Come on. Let's go eat before you start trying to fall in love. The two men stepped out into the corridor together. Another day inside Castle Grey Skull was officially underway. The walk to the chow hall had become part of Frederick Patterson's daily routine. Steel doors buzzed open, heavy gates slammed shut behind them. Correction officers watched from every corner. To most men, it was just another morning. To FP, it was another day survived. As he and Brian made their way through the prison, inmates greeted Frederick with quiet nods of respect. What's up, FP? Morning, Slim. How you holding up? Frederick acknowledged each man with a nod of his own. Respect wasn't something he demanded. It was something he earned. When word spread that the notorious Frederick Patterson was being transferred to Mansfield Correctional Institution, the entire prison buzzed with speculation. Stories traveled faster than inmates. Some said he had owned half of Cleveland. Others claimed he buried millions before the police ever laid a hand on him. Some believed he was the smartest drug supplier Ohio had ever seen. Others simply wanted to test him. Inside these walls, every reputation came with a challenge. Mansfield Correctional Institution wasn't just another prison. Among the inmates, it carried a different name, Castle Grey Skull, a place where reputations were either built or buried. Brian glanced over at Frederick as they entered the chow hall. You remember your first week in here? Frederick gave a slow grin. How could I forget? Brian chuckled. I knew somebody was going to try you. Frederick picked up his tray without looking up. So did I. And I made sure I was ready. Sometimes, the most dangerous weapon a man carried was the one nobody ever saw coming. Frederick Patterson learned something during his first week inside Mansfield Correctional Institution. Prison wasn't much different than the streets. The only difference? The walls were taller. Every new arrival was watched, studied, measured. Some inmates wanted to know your story. Others wanted to know how much they could take from you. Frederick already knew somebody would eventually make their move. It wasn't a matter of if, only when. He refused to be caught unprepared. Before leaving his cell each morning, he slipped 2 heavy master locks into a pair of tube socks. One in each sock. Simple, silent, devastating. Most correction officers never paid attention. To them, they were just socks. To Frederick, they were insurance. Brian noticed them one morning and laughed. You planning on building something with those? Frederick smiled without looking up. Nah. I'm planning on making sure I get back to the cell. Brian's grin slowly disappeared. He realized Frederick wasn't joking. Neither man spoke another word. Sometimes preparation looked like paranoia until the day it saved your life. 15 days after arriving at Castle Grayskull, that day finally came. His name was Antoine Fall, but nobody inside Mansfield called him that. To every inmate who walked those cell blocks, he was simply known as Bricks. Antoine Fall stood 6'4" and weighed nearly 280 pounds. His nickname, Bricks. The name fit him perfectly. Built like a brick wall, Bricks had spent the last 10 years making Mansfield Correctional Institution his personal kingdom. His reputation reached every corner of Castle Grayskull. Men feared him. Correction officers avoided unnecessary confrontations with him. If Bricks wanted your commissary, he took it. If he wanted your seat, you moved. If he wanted your respect, he demanded it. For 10 years, nobody challenged him. Fear had become his greatest weapon. Then Frederick Patterson arrived. The stories about Cleveland's most notorious kingpin reached Bricks long before FP ever stepped through the front gates. Some inmates spoke about his money. Others talked about his intelligence. Most talked about the respect he commanded on the streets. Bricks hated one thing more than anything else. Another man receiving attention. Inside his twisted mind, there could only be one king inside Castle Grayskull. If he wanted to keep that title, Frederick Patterson had to be humbled. Not tomorrow, not next week, immediately. So Bricks watched. He studied FP's routine, where he sat, who he talked to, what time he ate. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for the perfect opportunity to send a message. Frederick, on the other hand, already knew he was being watched. He could feel it. The same instincts that kept him alive on the streets were still protecting him behind prison walls. He didn't know exactly when it would happen. He didn't know exactly where. But one thing he knew without question. The first test was coming. It happened during breakfast. The chow hall buzzed with conversation as hundreds of inmates filled the tables. Metal trays scraped across steel. Voices echoed from every corner of the room. Frederick Patterson sat alone, quietly eating his breakfast. His attention stayed on his tray. His surroundings never left his mind. Across the chow hall, Bricks spotted him. A slow grin spread across his face. This is it, he thought. The entire prison had been waiting to see what would happen when the biggest name from Cleveland crossed paths with the biggest name inside Mansfield. Bricks picked up his tray and slowly walked toward Frederick's table. Every inmate who noticed him immediately stopped talking. The room began to quiet down. Some men lowered their forks. Others leaned back to get a better view. Even the correction officers sensed something was about to happen. Bricks stopped beside Frederick. His shadow covered the table. Frederick continued eating. Without looking up, Bricks finally spoke. Say, man, you're sitting in my seat. Frederick slowly raised his eyes. He looked at Bricks for a brief moment, then calmly picked up his tray. Without saying a word, he walked to another empty table and sat down. Bricks smiled. In his mind, the battle was already over. He believed Cleveland's legend had just backed down. Several inmates looked at one another in disbelief. Some shook their heads, others quietly laughed. Brian watched from across the chow hall, confused by what he had just witnessed. He knew Frederick Patterson, and he knew one thing for certain. FP didn't scare easily, so why did he walk away? Only one man in the entire chow hall knew the answer. Frederick Patterson, and Brix was about to find out. Brix slowly turned around. The smile on his face grew even wider. He watched Frederick sitting quietly at another table and mistook patience for fear. In Brix's mind, the legend of Frederick Patterson had just been exposed. He wanted everyone in the chow hall to see it. Slowly, he walked across the room toward FP's new table. Frederick looked up just long enough to notice one thing. Brix had made a mistake. He had stepped too close. Much too close. Frederick calmly placed his fork on the tray. His right hand slipped into his pocket. His fingers wrapped tightly around the socks. Brix leaned over the table until their faces were only inches apart. "I thought I told you. That's my seat." The chow hall became so quiet, you could hear trays being set down across the room. Every eye inside Castle Grayskull was fixed on the two men. Frederick slowly looked up at Brix. Then, a crooked smile crossed his face. It wasn't the smile of a scared man. It was the smile of a man who had finally been given permission to do what he already planned to do. Brix saw the smile, but he misunderstood it. He thought Frederick was bluffing. He couldn't have been more wrong. The next few seconds would change the balance of power inside Mansfield Correctional Institution forever. The first move happened so fast, most of the chow hall never saw it. Frederick exploded from his seat. His left hand shot forward, grabbing Brix by the back of the neck. With one violent motion, he yanked the giant off balance and drove his face straight into the steel table. Crack! The sound echoed through the chow hall. Brix staggered backward, blood pouring from his nose before he even realized what had happened. Frederick never gave him a chance to recover. In one smooth motion, he pulled the weighted socks from his pocket. The first swing landed flush against the left side of Brix's jaw. The impact sounded like a baseball bat striking concrete. Blood, teeth, and spit exploded across the floor. The force spun Brix completely around. Before he could regain his balance, Frederick swung again. The second blow crashed against the top of Brix's head. The heavy master locks connected with a sickening thud that silenced the entire chow hall. Brix collapsed to one knee. His hands desperately searched for something to hold on to. They found nothing. Frederick dropped the socks. He didn't need them anymore. He climbed over the table and met Brix before the giant could stand. His fists began raining down with a fury that had been building since the day he entered Mansfield. Every punch carried a message. Every punch answered every rumor. Every punch destroyed another piece of Brix's reputation. The giant who had terrorized Castle Grayskull for 10 years couldn't stop one man, Frederick Patterson. The chow hall erupted. For years, the inmates had watched Brix bully, intimidate, and humiliate anyone he chose. Now, they were watching someone fight back. "Get his ass! Beat his ass, FP!" The voices echoed throughout the dining hall as prisoners jumped to their feet to get a better look. Correction officers immediately rushed toward the fight, their nightsticks already drawn. But they were too late. Frederick Patterson had completely taken control. Brix tried to cover his face as blow after blow crashed into him. His strength, his size, his reputation, none of it mattered anymore. For the first time in 10 years, the bully was the one trying to survive. Blood covered the floor beneath him. Brix struggled to crawl away, but Frederick stayed on him. Every time Brix tried to rise, another punch drove him back down. The giant's resistance was fading. His movements became slower. His eyes struggled to focus. The correction officers finally reached them. It took several officers working together to pull Frederick off Brix. Even then, Frederick never took his eyes off him. His breathing was steady. His expression never changed. Brix lay motionless on the chow hall floor. His face was swollen beyond recognition. Blood poured from his mouth and head as medical staff rushed toward him. The entire chow hall fell silent. Hundreds of inmates stared at Frederick Patterson. Nobody cheered. Nobody laughed. They simply watched. In that moment, every man inside Castle Grayskull understood exactly who Frederick Patterson was. Respect had just found a new owner. Frederick Patterson offered no resistance as the correction officers forced his arms behind his back. The steel handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. "Get him out of here!" one officer yelled as another helped lift the battered Bricks from the chow hall floor. Blood dripped from Bricks's face onto the concrete as the medical team fought to stabilize him. He was still breathing, but barely. The inmates watched in complete silence. For years, Bricks had ruled Castle Gray's skull through fear. That reign had just come to an end. As the officers escorted Frederick toward the exit, inmates began stepping away from their tables. One by one, heads nodded. No words, no applause, just quiet acknowledgement. Inside prison, respect wasn't something you asked for. It was something you earned. Frederick had just earned every ounce of it. Brian stood near the doorway, watching his friend disappear down the corridor. A smile slowly crossed his face. He had never doubted how the fight would end, only how badly. One correction officer looked over at another and quietly shook his head. "I've worked here 12 years. I ain't never seen Bricks lose." Neither had anyone else. As the heavy steel doors slammed shut behind Frederick, the sound echoed through Castle Gray's skull. The legend of Bricks ended that morning. The legend of Frederick Patterson was only beginning. Frederick Patterson spent the next 3 months in solitary confinement, 23 hours a day, inside a concrete box no bigger than a bathroom. Steel, concrete, silence. For most men, the hole broke them. Frederick treated it like another obstacle to overcome. He read, he exercised. He replayed every decision that had brought him to Mansfield. The prison charged him with assault for what happened in the chow hall. Another conviction, another sentence, another number added to his file. None of it mattered. When you're already serving life, what's another charge? The only thing Frederick cared about was respect, and he had earned every bit of it. When he finally returned to the general population, Castle Gray's skull looked different. The same walls, the same guards, the same inmates. But the way people looked at him had changed forever. No one questioned his place. No one tested him. The challenge had been answered. Bricks survived the beating, but he was never the same man again. The injuries he suffered permanently changed him. The man who once ruled the institution through fear no longer inspired it. Power inside Castle Gray's skull had shifted, not because Frederick demanded it, because every inmate had witnessed it. Now, 1 year later, Frederick and Brian sat together in the chow hall, finishing breakfast as if it were any other morning. Brian shoveled another forkful of food into his mouth before leaning toward Frederick. "You see all them new correction officers that came in?" Frederick looked up. "I heard about 'em." Brian grinned. "Nah, you ain't heard about this one." Brian leaned across the table with a grin plastered across his face. "I'm telling you, FP, you need to see these new female guards." Frederick laughed as he shook his head. "You act like the warden hired 'em just for you." Brian shrugged. "A man can dream, can't he?" Frederick smiled. "Inside these walls, dreaming is free?" Brian chuckled before taking another bite of his breakfast. A few moments later, the large doors to the chow hall swung open. A sergeant entered, leading a group of newly hired correction officers through the facility. "There they go," Brian whispered. "There must have been 10 of them. Most were men, only 3 were women." The sergeant proudly pointed around the chow hall as he explained the daily operations of Mansfield Correctional Institution. Every new officer listened carefully, except one. Her name was Destiny Carmichael, 25 years old, 5'6", confident, beautiful. Long jet black hair flowed past her shoulders as she slowly scanned the room. Then, her eyes stopped on Frederick Patterson. She stared, not with fear, not with curiosity, recognition. Something about his face seemed familiar. She searched her memory for only a moment. Then it hit her. "Oh, my God." She whispered the words beneath her breath. The stories, the newspaper articles, the television reports. The man sitting quietly across the chow hall wasn't just another inmate. He was Frederick Patterson, the legendary drug kingpin from Cleveland, the man she'd heard about for years. She had imagined him 100 different ways. None of them looked like the quiet man eating breakfast without saying a word. For reasons she couldn't explain, she couldn't take her eyes off him. Brian had been nudging Frederick beneath the table for nearly a minute. Finally, Frederick looked up. Destiny Carmichael was still looking at him. The moment their eyes met, she smiled. Not the polite smile of a correction officer acknowledging another inmate. It was different, almost as if she had just met someone she'd been hearing about her entire life. Frederick returned a slight nod, nothing more. Destiny quickly gathered herself as the sergeant continued leading the tour through the chow hall. She fell back into line with the other officers, but before disappearing through the doors, she looked back one last time. Brian slowly turned toward Frederick with the biggest grin on his face. Damn, FP. What was all that about? Frederick shrugged as he continued eating. I don't know. Maybe she knows me from the streets. Brian laughed so hard he almost dropped his fork. Nah, I know that look. Frederick raised an eyebrow. Oh yeah. Brian pointed his fork toward the doorway Destiny had just walked through. That woman wasn't looking at no street legend. She was looking at you. Frederick shook his head. Man, you crazy. Brian leaned back in his chair, laughing. I'm serious. I've been locked up long enough to know the difference. She wasn't just looking. She was undressing your ass with her eyes. Frederick couldn't help but laugh. You need to worry about your own tray instead of worrying about mine. Brian grinned. I'm trying. But after seeing her, I forgot I was hungry. Brian finally swallowed the food in his mouth and shook his head. Man, I know dudes that's been in this prison 10, 15 years and still can't get a female guard to look at him. He pointed toward the doorway where Destiny had disappeared. You've been here 1 year, and one of the finest women in this institution just smiled at you. Frederick rolled his eyes. You reading too much into it. Brian laughed. No, you ain't reading enough into it. Frederick picked up his cup and took a drink. Maybe she recognized me from the news. Brian nodded. Exactly. And after recognizing you, she couldn't stop looking. Frederick smirked. You done built a whole love story off one smile. Brian burst out laughing. I'm just calling it like I see it. He leaned closer and lowered his voice. You know what it looked like to me? Frederick sighed. What? Brian grinned from ear to ear. It looked like she was eye-fucking you. Frederick looked at him in disbelief before shaking his head. Come on, Brian. Ain't your mama teach you not to talk with your mouth full? Brian immediately covered his mouth and laughed. My bad. He swallowed his food before continuing. But I'm serious. I've been watching guards around here for a long time. That wasn't curiosity. That was interest. Frederick chuckled as he pushed his empty tray away. Whatever you say. Come on. Finish eating. I want to hit the yard and get a workout in. Brian stood up with his tray and smiled. Yeah, but something tells me this ain't going to be the last time we hear about Officer Destiny Carmichael. Frederick picked up his tray and headed toward the tray return. He never looked back, but somewhere else inside Mansfield Correctional Institution. Destiny Carmichael couldn't stop thinking about the quiet man everyone called, Frederick Patterson. Every decision has a consequence. Every move writes another chapter. This is C-Town Slim Television, where the story never stops. If you rocked with this episode, hit that like button, subscribe, and share it with somebody who loves real stories. Until next time, stay sharp, stay focused, and remember, the next chapter is always one decision away.